Welcome to the video series, Is Your Church Ready for Change? My name is Allison Sack. I'm the founder of the 522 Group, where our mission is to help churches and nonprofits pursue their call in a fruitful way. As I stated in other videos, we're starting with the assumption that you, your church leadership, have already gone through the work of prayer and discernment, seeking God's guidance on the direction of your church. If you haven't done that already, I strongly recommend that you do that first and then come back to this video series once you understand what changes need to happen in your church in order to fully follow God's plan. In this video, we'll walk through examining and deconstructing communal perceptions or narratives. In the first video in this series, we looked at change impact assessments and change saturation. And then in the final video in this series, we'll look at communicating well. With that, let's begin in prayer. Lord God, guide us through your Spirit. Help us to seek your will and to follow the ways of your Son, so that we may bring glory to your church. Amen. Several years ago at a former church, when our longtime pastor retired, we went through the process of creating an information form. This form was going to be seen by pastors seeking to come to a new church and would help them to get an idea of who we were and about us, if you will. As part of that exercise, we decided to conduct a whole church survey, something that would help us to understand how the congregation was feeling about the church and what they thought the direction of the church should be. So it had questions like, what do you like best about the church? What is most important for a new pastor to know about us? It also had questions like, what do you see as our greatest challenge? What changes would you make? That type of thing. It was a pretty extensive survey covering a wide variety of topics, and we made the survey available to all. So whether they were longtime members or regular attenders or even visitors, they could fill out a paper copy of the survey. We also asked people to put how long they'd been attending the church, because we wanted to see if there was a difference of opinion between long-term members and maybe those who were newer. For the most part, we didn't get any responses that were particularly surprising. Everybody had an opinion about the music, of course. But we got feedback that we had the right ministries in place, both locally and internationally. And we got a lot of positive feedback about the fact that we had snacks available before the worship service and after the worship service. What was a surprise, however, was that not many people thought that we were a friendly church. And yet, when people came into our community, that's how we promoted ourselves. We were friendly. We were family friendly, kid friendly, teen friendly, intergenerationally friendly, neighborhood friendly. We were the friendly church. And if you came into our community in person, that's how we talked about ourselves, that we were a friendly church. But in the privacy of an anonymous survey, what people told us was that, in fact, we weren't a friendly church. And what was really surprising is there wasn't a difference between long-term attenders of the church or new attenders of the church. We got feedback that we were cliquish. It was hard to become part of a small group. Newcomers felt like outsiders. It was hard to get involved in ministries. It just was hard to become a part of our community. Now, I want to take a pause here and be very, very transparent. Most churches think that they're friendly, and most newcomers and visitors tell those very same churches that they're not as friendly as they think they are. But that's really a conversation for another video. So we definitely wanted to be a friendly church, but in order to get there, we had to start peeling back the layers of the myth, or deconstruct it, if you will, before we could begin to make changes to make that perception no longer a myth, but true. Because we definitely wanted to be perceived as a friendly church and wanted that public identity to be felt internally. Communal perceptions or narratives, how we perceive ourselves as a community, happen at all layers of a community, both big and small. You might belong to a sports team that sees itself as non-competitive and playing just for fun. That influences how you as a team behave with your opponents. As a team, you don't get angry or frustrated when you lose. You compliment the other team when they make a goal. It unifies you as a team. You choose members with the same outlook, or maybe you choose members with varying skill levels. Finally, it guides the values of your team. You don't give the referee a hard time. You act graciously towards each other, accepting mistakes and helping each other learn. Whether those communal perceptions happen on a small group level, like a team, or corporate level, like a church or a business, they unify us, they influence our behavior, and they guide our values. So, how do you go about deconstructing those communal perceptions that have now become myths? First, you need to separate out fact from fiction. And this can be tough, especially if the myth is particularly entrenched. Let's use another example to make this maybe a little bit easier. Let's say we've got a church that sees itself as the young, innovative, willing to try anything church, the upstarts that don't rely on tradition. But along with that communal narrative of being young and innovative, the pastor hears or maybe notices that it's hard for new things to get started and gain traction. That disconnect between the communal narrative and the reality creates an opportunity to dig a little deeper. So first, let's start with, is the church young? The church isn't young demographically, and in fact, it's fairly consistent with other churches' intergenerational mix. The church has been around for 20 years, so if it were a business, that would be considered an established business. Given that most churches in the United States have a median age of about 67 years, perhaps it can still be considered a little bit young. But the church has the same markers as many other established churches. The building has been added on to, it's gone through renovation and remodeling or modernization. The mortgage is low and almost paid off. And the church is now seeking for ways that they can help new churches grow and thrive. So maybe that's somewhat true, but is it relevant? Let's hold on to that. So is the church innovative and willing to try new things? Musically, the church is very open to new things. There are multiple choirs, and the music director does a great job of blending familiar and unfamiliar songs during the service. There's been great acceptance for skits during worship, and the congregation really seems to enjoy when the order of worship changes. In that respect, the church is innovative and willing to try new things. But the pastor has also heard from several people now that getting new study groups started is a challenge. Getting people to participate in new ministries is also challenging because the congregation likes things the way they are. The attitude is, it's fine how it is, and it seems to be working. And as the pastor looks into this a little more, another myth, only this one is hidden. And these hidden myths, unfortunately, can be killers of change. This myth is that the church is small and there just isn't the capacity to do more than what's being done already. The church has an average attendance of about 200 on Sundays compared to smaller churches, which would be about 100, and that number has only been growing. In fact, there have been multiple conversations about parking and making sure there's enough seating in the sanctuary on Sundays. The pastor has also heard from many of the newcomers that they'd like to participate and volunteer at the church. So now there needs to be the consideration that one myth might be influencing another. So now we've identified what's true and what's a myth, and even found another myth influencing your community. What do you do now? Once you've discovered those myths, you have to first consider your goals. It's important as you, your staff, and leadership team evaluate those communal perceptions, you gauge them against where God is leading your church. In this case, does it matter that your church sees itself as young? Not really. But this is the right time to start changing the conversation from being upstarts to we are a church that mentors and helps other churches. So while this communal perception doesn't need to be deconstructed per se, This is the right time to integrate something new that the community can unify around. And this really is a key concept to remember as the church experiences change, either external or internal. So, change in size, growing or shrinking, a change in the neighborhood, a change in organizational structure, or, like the story from the beginning, a new pastor. It's imperative to examine those communal perceptions because they could be holding you back from what God is calling your church to be today versus what God was calling your church to be in the past. To shift that communal perception for our example church from being the young church to the mentoring church really is a matter of communication. In these types of scenarios where you are tweaking an existing narrative, you will want to start with your leadership team. If you have elders or a leadership council, they've probably been involved with the decision to help newer churches and maybe even help sort through fact from fiction. So that might just be a matter of reminding them that the church has moved into a new era. From there, move on to your staff and your volunteers, making sure that they understand where the church is headed. Once leadership, staff, and volunteers are on board, then it's a matter of making sure messaging is consistent throughout the congregation. Many communal narratives happen organically, so shifting to a newer narrative can happen organically as well. For our example church, not only will this become a new unifying force, bringing the church together, but by shifting the wording, this also begins to influence behavior, how they allocate budget and time towards mentoring other churches. And it also becomes a new guiding value of the church. So, for our example church, the communal narrative of innovation is going to be trickier. We definitely don't want to completely deconstruct it because that innovation in the worship service is true and it's a positive for the community. So, in this type of scenario, you would want to lean in and encourage more. If you were the pastor of this church, this would be an opportunity to start another choir or bring more people into the worship band. Perhaps there's space for a youth band, what have you. The possibilities truly are endless in this case. The important thing to remember is that when you have those communal perceptions that are true, they coincide with God's call and they are a positive for the community. These are your strengths, the secret sauce of your community, if you will. And this becomes an opportunity to dive in a little bit more and see where God is calling your church to leverage its strengths. So now onto the part of innovation that isn't so true for our example church. While there is innovation and a willingness to try new things within worship, the community isn't so open outside of worship. And in fact, the pastor has discovered another myth. The myth that the congregation is too small and there isn't the volunteer capacity. In this instance, we can confirm it's a myth because of the data, the church's attendance, the need for more parking and spaces to sit. And anecdotally, the pastor knows this isn't true because people are asking how they can get involved and volunteer. As you begin to deconstruct myths, you will need to rely on as much data as you can. In the story I shared at the beginning, as we sought to understand why we weren't a friendly church, we didn't have data from visitors or even congregants who had left. We only had the impressions from the people who filled out the survey. So we faithfully trusted that where there was smoke, there's fire. While data is desirable, the truth is we don't always have what we need. In that case, gather as much feedback as you can to help paint the picture of why the communal narrative may no longer be true. Now back to our example church. What really needs to be deconstructed is not the myth of innovation. In fact, we don't know if it's true or not because the myth of size and capacity is what's really driving behavior. So this is the myth that needs to be deconstructed, and it's critical to do so. At one time, when the church was new and small, it was true and a safeguard to burnout. It was right. It was the right conversation for that time. But now it's creating a chokehold, and it will become a threat to the life of the church if it isn't deconstructed. Sounds dire and ominous, I know, but unfortunately, it's true. As you begin to examine what might be a myth and discover underlying myths, which are driving behavior and values, those underlying myths need to be a priority as they are preventing change and change acceptance.
So, how do we go about deconstructing this myth? This is going to be harder because there is more involved and it will require deliberateness. So, we'll take it in parts, and you'll want to take this approach as you find myths that need to be deconstructed. So, the first part of the myth is the perception that the church or the congregation is small. When you're deconstructing myths, look first at the perception and then how that perception doesn't meet with reality. In our example church, the perception is that it's small, but reality and the data we talked about before tells us that the church is in fact growing. So the second step is to begin asking questions. And it goes without saying that you're not going to ask questions like you're grilling people under bright lights. Instead, come from a place of curiosity and do your best to ask questions without using the word why. Why, you ask? Because the word why typically puts people on the defensive. So for our example church, we wouldn't ask, why do you think we're too small? Instead, you would say, help me understand how our size makes this not the right time to do X, Y, or Z. Or what size should we be before doing X, Y, or Z? In some cases, just asking the question from a place of curiosity helps people to understand they may be holding on to outdated perceptions. Other times, you may need to be prepared to ask more questions and dig deeper before you can gently turn people towards what is now the new reality. For our example church, that would be pointing out that the church is growing and the continued talks around space. Or maybe we gently point out that just because a church is small doesn't mean it's confined to only doing small things. When dealing with hidden myths, start with your leadership team or any who have influence within the church. Depending upon the size of your church, this might include volunteers and staff members. These are people who have wider spheres of influence within the community and will share organically when they start to encounter those same hidden myths. You may need to watch for communications that still perpetuate the myth. For our example church, that might be things that start with, because we are small. The single most important thing you can do to deconstruct a myth is to ask questions. It's important that as you begin the process that you're willing to go beyond the first answer if just asking the initial question doesn't have people thinking through their assumptions. Start peeling back the layers, as I said earlier in this video.
The more likely scenario for our example church is that there's an impression that there's not enough willing volunteers. And this is a typical conversation around a lot of churches, whether they're big or they're small. And again, we're going to reach into our toolbox and we're going to ask questions. Unlike perception myths, where you're helping people to see a new reality, these questions are going to be around actions. So, for example, when was the last time we asked for volunteers? Again, we're going to come from a place of curiosity. In this case, we've got some data that we can rely on. When was the last time a request was put in the weekly bulletin or the congregational email? When was the last time it was part of announcements? Do we have a page on the website where people can go and understand where there's a need or sign up to volunteer? When we start asking action questions, it's really to understand how the actions of leadership, volunteers, or our staff are really perpetuating the myth. We all get into a rut without realizing it. So typically, your myths are going to be built around a myth of perception or a myth around action or lack thereof. And that's what's actually keeping that myth going. I always think about it as digging for treasure, right? You find a little nugget, but you know that that nugget is only a small piece of the whole. So you keep digging and you keep digging until you actually get to the treasure chest. And it's that treasure chest which is really the center of the whole issue. Hopefully you're noticing that there's some common themes happening around communal perceptions. First, You need to continually assess and reassess those community narratives. What's true, what's partially true, and what's a myth. These perceptions or narratives are guiding your church for better or for worse. And they are what your community unifies around. They influence behavior in your community, and they guide communal values. So as you seek to make changes in your church, assess against your goals. What needs to be tweaked? What's a strength? And what needs to be deconstructed? The second theme I hope you're seeing is communication, and that needs to be two-way communication. Encourage your leaders, your staff, and your volunteers when they hear feedback to ask questions and be curious, especially when they're hearing feedback around those communal narratives. It's easy to want to shore them up, but it's imperative that we listen and that we understand what may no longer be true or might actually be hiding an underlying narrative. And here's where I would caution you. Make sure you're not the one who's perpetuating those myths, either by your own perceptions or even by your own actions. Now, let's go back to the story I told at the beginning. We had lots of feedback from our surrounding neighborhood and the school next door that we were helpful and friendly to our neighbors. So that was true, and it was a strength that we could identify and then lead into. We also discovered through multiple conversations and asking questions that it was true. We were cliquish, and it was hard to join small groups. So by making a few tweaks to our small group process and asking our greeters to make a few changes, we went from being not friendly to friendly. We gathered this information from another survey that we did much later. So we knew that while we had work to do, we were slowly making progress to making that communal narrative true again. As I said before, communal perceptions happen organically. So it's going to take some time to turn, shift, or deconstruct those narratives. And it's not going to happen overnight, because what you're really trying to do is reform identity so that the church remains open and ready to respond to God's call. I hope you found this video helpful and you feel ready to examine communal narratives within your own church, and you can lean into your strengths or deconstruct what is no longer true. I value your engagement. If you would please like, share, or join in the discussion in the comment section below. As always, I'm here to help. And so if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. May God bless your church and all within it. Go in peace.